She signed the divorce papers in tears, but smiled when the judge handed her the house keys. The Seattle courthouse stood like a gray monument against the overcast morning sky, its cold stone walls reflecting the somber mood of those who entered seeking justice, closure, or simply an end to what had once been love. Ariella Offerman adjusted her navy blazer as she climbed the steps, her breath visible in the crisp November air. At 32, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that hadn't been broken by the past 8 months of betrayal and heartbreak. Inside the sterile hallway, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on faces marked by legal battles and broken promises. Ariella's attorney, Ms. Janet Kellaway, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, waited near the courtroom entrance with a manila folder thick with documents that would legally dissolve 7 years of marriage. "Are you ready for this, Ariella?" Janet asked, her voice gentle but professional. She had seen too many women crumble at this moment, but something about Ariella was different. There was steel beneath the silk. Ariella nodded, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly where her 4-month-old daughter grew stronger each day. "I've been ready since the day I found them together in our bed." The courtroom doors opened, and Ariella's composure wavered for just a moment. There he was, Nick Offerman, 36 and still devastatingly handsome in that practiced way that had once made her heart skip. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit expensive and tailored, but his eyes, those brown eyes that had once promised her forever, now avoided her gaze entirely. Beside him sat Elaine Miles, 29, and deliberately stunning. Her red hair fell in perfect waves over a white dress that seemed chosen specifically to mock the sanctity of what was ending today. Elaine's green eyes sparkled with a cruel satisfaction as she spotted Ariella, and her glossy lips curved into a smile that said, "I won." Nick's attorney, a slick-looking man named Bradley Hutchins, shuffled papers with the efficiency of someone who dismantled marriages for a living. He leaned over to whisper something to Nick, who finally looked up and met Ariella's eyes across the courtroom. For a split second, something flickered across Nick's face. Regret, perhaps, or recognition of what he was losing. But then Elaine placed her manicured hand possessively on his arm, and whatever moment of doubt he'd had vanished. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Margaret Thornfield entered. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen every kind of human failing imaginable. As they sat, Ariella felt the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy coat. This was it, the official end of everything she had believed in, everything she had built, everything she had loved. The proceedings began with the dry recitation of case numbers and legal formalities. Judge Thornfield's voice cut through the air with practiced efficiency as she outlined the terms of the divorce settlement. Nick would keep his car and his personal belongings. Ariella would receive spousal support for 6 months. A pittance, really, considering Nick's income as a successful real estate broker. The matter of the house at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive remains under review pending financial documentation, Judge Thornfield noted, glancing at the papers before her. Ariella's heart clenched. The house, their house, with its blue shutters and the garden where she had planted roses on their 2nd anniversary. The kitchen where she had cooked countless dinners, waiting for Nick to come home from showings. The bedroom where they had made love and planned their future, never knowing that future had an expiration date. "Mrs. Offerman," the judge continued, "you understand that by signing these documents you are agreeing to the dissolution of your marriage and the terms outlined within?" Ariella stood, her legs steadier than she felt. "Yes, Your Honor." The papers were placed before her, 7 years reduced to signatures and initials. She picked up the pen, a simple black ballpoint that would write the ending of her story as Mrs. Offerman. Behind her, she could hear Elaine's barely contained giggle, a sound like breaking glass. Nick cleared his throat, a nervous habit he'd had since college. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the pen against paper. As Ariella signed her name for the final time, a single tear escaped and fell onto the document, smearing her signature slightly. But it wasn't the tear of a broken woman. It was the tear of someone saying goodbye to a dream that had become a nightmare. She set the pen down and looked up at Judge Thornfield, then across the courtroom at Nick. He was staring at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. Elaine, however, was practically glowing with triumph, her hand now intertwined with Nick's in a display that was more about ownership than affection. "The divorce is hereby granted," Judge Thornfield declared, bringing down her gavel with a finality that echoed through the room. Ariella stood and gathered her purse, her movements slow and deliberate. As she turned to leave, she caught Nick's eye one last time. There was something desperate in his gaze, something that looked almost like panic, but it was too late for panic, too late for regrets, too late for apologies. Walking toward the exit, Ariella felt something unexpected blooming in her chest. Not relief exactly, but something close to it. Freedom, perhaps. Or maybe just the first breath of air after being underwater for too long. Outside the courthouse, the Seattle drizzle had begun, painting the world in shades of gray. Ariella pulled her coat tighter around her growing belly and smiled. Not the broken smile of a victim, but the quiet, determined smile of a woman who had just realized that sometimes the end of one story was simply the beginning of another. Behind her, through the courthouse windows, she could see Nick and Elaine embracing. They looked like they were celebrating. But Ariella knew something they didn't yet understand. Some victories were just losses wearing disguises. As she walked to her car, her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emma. "How did it go? Are you okay?" Ariella typed back with steady fingers. "It's over, and I'm going to be just fine." For the first time in months, she actually believed it. 3 weeks after the divorce, Ariella stood in the doorway of a modest one-bedroom apartment in Fremont, her hands resting on her growing belly as she surveyed her new life. The space was small, a fraction of the size of the house she'd shared with Nick, but it was hers. No memories of betrayal lingered in these walls. No echoes of broken promises whispered in the corners. The apartment came furnished with basics: a cream-colored sofa that had seen better days, a kitchen table for two, and a bedroom just large enough for a bed, and the crib she'd already ordered online. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patches on the hardwood floors that creaked welcomingly under her feet. "It's perfect," she murmured to her unborn daughter, one hand tracing circles on her belly. "We don't need much, do we, little one? Just each other." Her sister Emma arrived an hour later with boxes of Ariella's belongings, the few things Nick had allowed her to take from their former home. Emma was 2 years younger, but had always been the fiercer of the two sisters, with auburn hair that matched her fiery temperament and a protective streak that ran deeper than the Puget Sound. "I still can't believe he only let you take your clothes and grandmother's china," Emma said, setting down a box marked kitchen with more force than necessary. "That house was half yours, everything in it was half yours." Ariella folded a sweater into her dresser drawer, her movements calm and methodical. "Let him keep it all, Em. Things are just things. I got out with what matters most." She gestured to her belly with a small smile. Emma's expression softened. "Have you decided on a name yet?" "Clara," Ariella said without hesitation. "Her name is Clara. Clara Offerman." Emma tested the name. "I like it. Beautiful name for a beautiful girl." Ariella paused in her unpacking. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time to go back to being a Whitmore. Clara Whitmore has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" Meanwhile, across town in the house that had once been a home, Nick was discovering that his fairy tale ending came with complications he hadn't anticipated. Elaine had moved in the day after the divorce was finalized, and the transformation of his space had been swift and complete. Gone were Ariella's soft touches, the throw pillows in warm earth tones, the framed photographs of family gatherings, the books scattered on side tables. In their place were Elaine's preferences: stark white furniture, abstract art that looked expensive but felt cold, and surfaces so clean they seemed untouchable. "Nick, baby, we need to talk about the master bathroom," Elaine called from upstairs, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant she'd found something else that needed changing. "That shower is barely big enough for one person, let alone two. We need to renovate." Nick looked up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing property listings for clients. Business had been good lately. Seattle's real estate market was booming, and his commission checks reflected that success. But Elaine's requests for improvement seemed endless, and each one came with a price tag that made him wince. "The shower's fine, Elaine. We just redid that bathroom 2 years ago." She appeared at the top of the stairs, her red hair cascading over a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's rent. Ariella might have been okay with fine, but I'm not Ariella. I have standards. The way she said Ariella's name, with a mixture of disdain and triumph, made something twist uncomfortably in Nick's stomach. He closed his laptop and climbed the stairs, trying to push away the memory of how Ariella used to greet him at the end of the day, always with a smile and asking about his work, genuinely interested in his answers. Elaine was examining the bathroom with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection. "We'll need to expand into the guest bedroom, install a walk-in shower, maybe add a soaking tub." I'm thinking marble everywhere. Carrara, perhaps. Very elegant. That would cost at least 30,000, Nick said, leaning against the doorframe. So? Elaine turned to him with raised eyebrows. You're doing well, aren't you? I mean, that's what you told me when you were trying to convince me to leave Richard. Richard, her previous boyfriend, a divorced surgeon who had apparently bored Elaine with his stability and devotion. Nick pushed that thought away too. He'd won after all. He'd gotten the girl everyone else wanted. Of course I'm doing well, he said, forcing confidence into his voice. It's just, maybe we should pace ourselves. Get settled first. Elaine's expression cooled noticeably. I see. So when you were married to Little Miss Perfect, you could afford to renovate. But now that you're with me, suddenly money's tight? That's not what I said. It's what you meant. She brushed past him toward the bedroom, her shoulder bumping his arm with deliberate force. I'm going to shower. Alone. Since apparently that's all this pathetic excuse for a bathroom can accommodate. As the bathroom door slammed shut, Nick found himself standing alone in the hallway of his own house, feeling strangely unwelcome. From behind the door came the sound of running water and Elaine's voice, raised just loud enough for him to hear, talking on her phone. I know, right? It's like he thinks I'm some kind of charity case who should be grateful for leftovers. No, the house is nice enough, but it needs work. Major work. Well, we'll see how long this lasts. I've got options, you know. Nick's jaw tightened. Options. The word hit him like cold water, awakening a possessiveness he hadn't expected to feel. He'd given up everything for this woman. His marriage, his integrity, the respect of friends who'd known him and Ariella as a couple. She was supposed to be grateful, devoted, worth the sacrifice. Instead, she was already talking about options. Back in Fremont, Ariella had finished unpacking and was sitting at her small kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea, making lists on a yellow legal pad. Her handwriting was neat and purposeful. Doctor appointment Tuesday, prenatal vitamins. Call about daycare near Sunshine Children's Center. Tomorrow she would return to work at Sunshine Children's Center, where she'd been an assistant teacher before the divorce proceedings had consumed her time and energy. The pay wasn't much, but it was honest work that she loved, and the director, Mrs. Carol Dunn, had been understanding about her situation. Her phone rang, interrupting her planning. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Hello? Mrs. Offerman? This is Janet Kellaway. I have some news about the house. Ariella's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of news? Well, it's interesting. It seems your ex-husband has been late on the mortgage payments. Twice in the past month. The bank contacted me because you're still listed as a co-borrower on the original loan. What does that mean? It means that legally, you're still partially responsible for that debt. But it also means you still have certain rights regarding the property. I think we should meet and discuss your options. After hanging up, Ariella sat in the growing dusk of her small apartment, one hand on her belly where Clara was beginning to kick more frequently. Through the thin wall, she could hear her neighbor's television and the distant sound of traffic on Aurora Avenue. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was her life. Clean and simple and free from the toxicity that had poisoned her marriage. As Clara gave a particularly strong kick, Ariella smiled. Daddy's already making mistakes, she whispered to her daughter. But that's not our problem anymore, is it? We're going to be just fine on our own. Outside her window, the Seattle skyline glittered with the promise of evening, and for the first time since signing those divorce papers, Ariella felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sunshine Children's Center as Ariella tied her apron around her expanding waist. At nearly 6 months pregnant, she moved with the careful grace of a woman who had learned to balance her changing body with the demands of chasing after toddlers. The familiar sounds of children's laughter and the gentle chaos of breakfast time felt like a balm to her soul. Ariella, honey, how are you feeling today? Mrs. Carol Dunn, the center's director, approached with the warm smile that had made parents trust their most precious treasures to her care for over 20 years. Carol was a sturdy woman in her late 50s, with graying brown hair always pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing when it came to the well-being of both children and staff. Better every day, Mrs. Dunn, Ariella replied, settling into the tiny chair at the art table where 3-year-old twins, Jasmine and Jacob, were already wielding crayons with the enthusiasm only small children could muster. Miss Ariella, Jasmine looked up with delight, her dark curls bouncing. Look, I drew my mommy. The drawing was a typical preschooler masterpiece, a stick figure with an enormous head and a bright purple dress. But what struck Ariella was the smile on the crayon mommy's face, wide and happy and uncomplicated. "She's beautiful, sweetheart. I can see how much you love her. Are you going to be a mommy too?" Jacob asked, pointing at Ariella's belly with the blunt curiosity of childhood. "Yes, I am. Very soon. Will you love your baby like I love my mommy?" Ariella felt her throat tighten with emotion. More than anything in the whole world. Across town, Nick was discovering that love wasn't always enough to maintain peace in paradise. He sat in his BMW outside Elaine's favorite boutique downtown, watching through the window as she held up designer dresses that cost more than some people's monthly rent. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his mortgage company, and the stress was starting to show in the tight line of his shoulders and the way he gripped the steering wheel. When Elaine emerged with 2 large shopping bags, her expression was already shifting from satisfaction to something harder to read. "These will be perfect for the Henderson Gala next month," she said, sliding into the passenger seat. "You did RSVP for us, didn't you?" Nick started the engine, avoiding her eyes. "Actually, I'm not sure we should go this year. Things are a little tight right now, and the tickets are $500 each. "Excuse me?" Elaine's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Did you just say we can't afford a charity gala? What kind of image does that send? What will people think?" "People will think I'm being responsible with my finances." Elaine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Responsible? Or cheap? Because there's a difference, Nick. A big difference." She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts with deliberate slowness. "You know, Richard never had problems with money. He understood that image matters in this city. Connections matter." There it was again. Richard. The surgeon who had apparently been stable, successful, and boring. Nick's hands tightened on the wheel. "If Richard was so perfect, maybe you should have stayed with him." "Maybe I should have." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. They drove the rest of the way home in silence, but Nick could feel the weight of Elaine's disappointment filling the car like toxic gas. When they pulled into the driveway of the house he'd once shared with Ariella, he noticed the lawn needed mowing and one of the gutters was pulling away from the roof. Everything seemed to be falling apart at once. That evening, while Nick tried to focus on client emails, Elaine was on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice carried clearly through the house, and he realized she wasn't trying to keep the conversation private. "I know, Tiffany, but what was I supposed to do? He's acting like we're some kind of broke college students. No, the sex isn't worth it anymore. Not when he's turning into such a miser. Well, maybe I need to start keeping my options open again. A girl has to think about her future." Nick closed his laptop with more force than necessary. 6 months ago, Elaine had made him feel like the most desirable man in Seattle. She'd hung on his every word, laughed at his jokes, made him feel powerful and irresistible. Now she was talking about him to her friends like he was a disappointing purchase she was considering returning. Meanwhile, at her small apartment, Ariella was having a very different kind of evening. She sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by pregnancy books and baby name websites on her laptop, making lists of things she'd need for Clara's arrival. The quiet was peaceful rather than lonely, filled with possibility instead of tension. Her phone rang and she smiled when she saw Emma's name on the screen. "Hey, Em. Hey yourself. How was your first week back at work?" "Wonderful, actually. I forgot how much I love being around the kids. They're so honest, so pure. No hidden agendas, no games, just real emotions and real reactions. Unlike certain people we know," Emma said dryly. Ariella laughed. "I try not to think about Nick anymore. It's amazing how much mental energy you free up when you stop worrying about someone else's lies and broken promises. Good for you. Oh, speaking of which, I saw his car at Nordstrom today. That redhead of his was carrying about 6 shopping bags. Guess the divorce settlement didn't slow her spending down any." Ariella felt a brief flicker of her old pain, but it passed quickly. That's his choice to make now, and his problem to solve. "You're really over him, aren't you?" Ariella considered the question seriously. "I'm over who I thought he was. The real Nick. The one who could lie to my face for months, who could abandon his pregnant wife, who chose selfishness over integrity. I don't think I ever really knew that person, and I don't want to." After they hung up, Ariella ran a bath and lowered herself carefully into the warm water. Clara was active tonight, pushing and stretching as if she were already eager to meet the world. Ariella placed both hands on her belly and spoke softly. "Your daddy made his choice, little girl. He chose someone who only loves him when he's giving her what she wants. But you and I were going to build something different, something real and lasting and true." She thought about the children at the center. about their uncomplicated love and trust, about the way they saw the world in primary colors with clear lines between right and wrong. Maybe that's what she needed to reclaim. That clarity, that simplicity, that ability to love without conditions but also without illusions. 20 minutes later, Nick was lying in bed next to Elaine, staring at the ceiling while she scrolled through social media on her phone. The space between them felt like a canyon, even though they were only inches apart. "Nick," she said without looking up from her screen, "I've been thinking, maybe we should take a trip somewhere. Cabo, maybe, or that new resort in Turks and Caicos." "Elaine, we just talked about money this afternoon. This afternoon you embarrassed me in front of the entire city. Tomorrow, I want you to fix it." She finally turned to look at him, and her green eyes were cold and calculating. "Unless you want me to start thinking that Richard's looking pretty good right about now." Nick turned away from her and closed his eyes, but sleep felt impossible. In the dark, with Elaine's subtle threats echoing in his ears, he found himself thinking about Ariella for the first time in weeks. Ariella, who had never demanded expensive trips or designer clothes, who had been content with quiet evenings and simple pleasures, who had loved him not for what he could provide but for who he was, or who she'd thought he was. The irony wasn't lost on him that in gaining everything he'd thought he wanted, he was discovering what he'd actually lost. And unlike Elaine's easily bought affection, some things couldn't be purchased back once they were gone. 2 months had passed since Elaine's ultimatum about the resort vacation, and Nick found himself staring at his credit card statement with the kind of numb disbelief usually reserved for natural disasters. The 10-day trip to Turks and Caicos had cost nearly $15,000, money he didn't have, charged to cards that were already carrying more debt than he was comfortable with. But Elaine had been insistent, and her threats about Richard had become less subtle and more frequent. So he'd booked the trip, smiled through her social media posts about their perfect getaway, and tried not to think about the mounting bills waiting for them back home. Now sitting in his office at Cascade Realty, Nick massaged his temples and tried to focus on the Henderson property listing that should have been his ticket out of financial trouble. The Hendersons were selling their waterfront estate for $3.2 million, a commission that would solve a lot of problems. But the market had cooled recently, and what should have been a quick sale was dragging into its 3rd month. His phone buzzed with a text from Elaine. "Lunch at the Georgian? Meet you there at 1. Wear something nice. The Chambers will be there." Nick glanced at his watch. 12:45. He barely had time to get there, let alone change clothes. The Georgian was one of Seattle's most expensive restaurants, the kind of place where lunch for two easily ran $200. The kind of place Ariella would have suggested they skip in favor of the little Thai place around the corner, where they could eat well for $30 and actually talk without worrying about impressing anyone. He pushed that thought away and grabbed his jacket. 20 minutes later, Nick walked into the Georgian's pristine dining room to find Elaine already seated at a prime table, her red hair perfectly styled and her smile bright for the couple she was entertaining. Robert and Diane Chambers, old money Seattle, the kind of people whose approval could make or break a real estate career. "Nick, darling." Elaine stood and kissed his cheek with theatrical affection. "I was just telling the Chambers about our divine trip to the islands. It sounded absolutely magical," Diane said with the kind of polite enthusiasm that the wealthy reserved for expensive vacations they took twice a year. "We'll have to get the name of your resort." Nick forced a smile and sat down, already calculating the cost of this lunch and wondering how he'd explain another credit card charge to himself. As Elaine regaled their table mates with stories of private beaches and 5-star service, he found his mind wandering to more practical concerns. The mortgage payment due next week, the car payment, the stack of Elaine's shopping receipts accumulating on his desk at home. Meanwhile, across town at Sunshine Children's Center, Ariella was experiencing a very different kind of afternoon. She sat in the reading corner with a group of 4-year-olds, her belly now prominently rounded at 7 months, reading The Velveteen Rabbit, in the gentle voice that made even the most restless children settle down and listen. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day. Ariella read, unconsciously smoothing her hand over her belly where Clara was having what felt like a dance party. Little Sophie, a quiet girl with serious brown eyes, raised her hand. "Miss Ariella, is your baby real?" Ariella smiled. "Very real, sweetheart. She kicks me all the time to prove it. My mommy says babies are miracles," added Tommy, a freckled boy who rarely sat still for more than 2 minutes. "Your mommy is very smart," Ariella said. "Babies are definitely miracles." As she continued reading, Ariella felt a contentment that had nothing to do with expensive restaurants or luxury vacations. This was real, these children, this work, the life growing inside her. Simple, honest, uncomplicated by games or manipulations or conditions. After the children went down for their afternoon nap, Carol Dunn approached with 2 cups of chamomile tea and the concerned expression of someone who had been watching carefully. "How are you really doing, honey?" Carol asked, settling into the chair beside Ariella. "And don't give me the standard fine answer. I've been watching you for weeks now and you seem different, stronger." Ariella considered the question while sipping her tea. "I am different. I think I'm becoming who I was always supposed to be before I got lost trying to be what someone else wanted. That's a hard lesson to learn, but an important one. The funny thing is," Ariella continued, "I spent so many years trying to make Nick happy, trying to be the perfect wife that I forgot what made me happy. These kids remind me every day that happiness doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as a good story or a hug when you need one." Carol smiled. "Have you given any thought to what you'll do after Clara is born? I know we've talked about maternity leave, but I mean longer term." "Actually, I have been thinking about that." Ariella set down her teacup. "I love working here and I was wondering if there might be opportunities for me to grow professionally. Maybe get my early childhood education certification, work toward becoming a lead teacher someday. That's a wonderful goal. The state has some great programs for working mothers to get their certifications. We could work around your schedule. I'd like that." Ariella paused, feeling Clara shift position. "I want to build something stable for her. Nothing fancy or dramatic, just a good life. A steady job I love, a safe home. Maybe even some savings for her college fund someday. Simple things, but real things." Back at the Georgian, lunch was winding down with the kind of artificial cheer that expensive wine couldn't quite mask. The Chambers had departed with promises to call about potential properties, and Nick was left with Elaine and a check that made his stomach clench. "That went well, don't you think?" Elaine said, touching up her lipstick in her compact mirror. "Diane practically promised to let us handle their lake house sale." "Practically isn't actually," Nick replied, signing the credit card slip with a flourish that felt like signing his own death warrant. Elaine's smile faltered slightly. "You've been so negative lately, Nick. It's not attractive. I'm being realistic. Do you know how much debt we're carrying right now?" "We?" Elaine's eyebrows rose. "I don't recall signing any loan applications or mortgage papers. That would be your debt, not mine." The casual way she said it, as if their relationship was a business arrangement she could exit at any time, hit Nick like cold water. "I see. So when things are good, it's we. But when there are problems, it's me? Don't be dramatic. I'm just saying that I didn't create your financial situation. Maybe if you were better at closing deals instead of complaining about money all the time, we wouldn't have this problem." Nick stared at her across the white tablecloth, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time the woman he'd destroyed his marriage for. Beautiful, yes. Charming when it suited her purposes, absolutely. But underneath the perfect exterior was someone who viewed relationships as transactions, who measured love by the dollar amount attached to it. "You know what's funny?" he said quietly. "Ariella never once complained about money, even when we were struggling to make ends meet those first few years. She found ways to make every dollar stretch, made home feel like a palace even when we were eating pasta for the 4th night in a row." Elaine's expression turned glacial. "Well, I'm not Ariella. I have standards. And if you can't meet them..." She left the threat hanging in the air like expensive perfume. As they walked to their cars in the restaurant's parking garage, Nick felt the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd traded a woman who loved him for who he was, for a woman who only tolerated him for what he could provide. And what he could provide was rapidly disappearing. That evening, while Nick sat alone in his home office trying to figure out how to pay bills with money he didn't have, Ariella was in her small kitchen preparing a simple dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables. The radio played softly in the background, and Clara was unusually active, as if she could sense her mother's peaceful mood. Her phone rang, and she smiled to see Janet Kellaway's name on the caller ID. "Good evening, Janet." "Ariella, I have some interesting news. Remember how I told you that you still had certain rights regarding the house because of the co-borrower situation?" "Yes. Well, your ex-husband has missed another mortgage payment. The 3rd one in 4 months. The bank is starting to get very nervous, and they've been asking questions about you, specifically about your current financial status, and whether you might be interested in assuming the loan yourself." Ariella set down her spatula and leaned against the counter. "What would that mean exactly?" It would mean that if the bank decides to foreclose, you could potentially step in and take over the property, assuming you could demonstrate ability to make the payments. Given your employment and the relatively modest monthly payment compared to current rent prices, you think I could actually get the house back? I think it's a real possibility. And given that your ex-husband put all that money into renovations over the years, the equity would be substantial. It would be like getting back everything he took from you, plus interest. After hanging up, Ariella stood in her kitchen, one hand on her belly, contemplating the strange turns life could take. The house that had once represented her shattered dreams might become the foundation for her new beginning. And Nick, who had thought he'd won everything, was about to discover that some victories were just losses in disguise. The Henderson property had been on the market for 4 months, and Nick could feel his career slipping through his fingers like sand. What should have been the commission that solved all his problems had become a daily reminder of how quickly things could fall apart. The buyers who had seemed so interested in March were now reassessing their options. Real estate code for looking elsewhere. Nick sat in his car outside the empty waterfront mansion, staring at his phone screen where 3 missed calls from his mortgage company glowed like warning lights. He couldn't keep avoiding them forever, but he also couldn't give them money he didn't have. The credit cards were maxed out, the savings account was empty, and Elaine's spending showed no signs of slowing down. His phone buzzed with a text. At Tiffany's looking at earrings. Should I get the diamonds or the emeralds? Both are gorgeous. Nick stared at the message, feeling something cold and hard settling in his stomach. Earrings at Tiffany's. While he was juggling bills and dodging creditors, she was shopping for jewelry that probably cost more than most people's car payments. He typed back, "Neither. We need to talk about money." Her response came immediately. "Don't be such a downer. You'll figure it out. You always do." The casual dismissal of his stress, the assumption that his financial problems were just minor inconveniences that would magically resolve themselves, hit him like a slap. For the first time, Nick allowed himself to really think about what his life had become. When had he become the kind of man who couldn't afford his own house? When had he started measuring his worth by whether he could pay for his girlfriend's shopping sprees? Meanwhile, at Sunshine Children's Center, Ariella was having a very different kind of day. At 8 months pregnant, she moved more slowly, but with a growing sense of purpose that surprised even her. She was helping 5-year-old Lucas with his alphabet when she felt a familiar flutter kick from Clara. "Miss Ariella, your tummy moved." Lucas giggled, pointing at her belly with the wonder that only children possessed. "That's my baby saying hello," Ariella said, smiling. "She's very active today. Is she excited to meet you?" "I think she is. I'm certainly excited to meet her." Mrs. Dunn approached with an enrollment form and the warm smile that had become so familiar and comforting. "Ariella, could we chat for a moment during lunch break? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." An hour later, they sat in Carol's office with the door closed and cups of decaf coffee between them. "I've been thinking about what you said last month about wanting to grow professionally," Carol began. "We have a lead teacher position opening up in the fall. Jennifer is moving to Portland with her husband, and I'd like you to consider applying for her position." Ariella felt her heart skip. "Mrs. Dunn, that's incredibly generous, but I don't have my certification yet, and with the baby coming, the certification can be worked around. The state offers night classes and online options for working mothers. As for the baby, we have one of the best childcare policies in the city. Clara would essentially grow up here with you, and you'd be building a real career, not just working a job." Ariella sat back in her chair, one hand unconsciously moving to her belly. A lead teacher position would mean better pay, better benefits, and the chance to shape the program she'd fallen in love with. It wasn't glamorous or dramatic, but it was real growth, real stability. What would the timeline be? Jennifer leaves at the end of August. You'd have your maternity leave, then start the new position when Clara is about 3 months old. It's perfect timing, actually. As they discussed details, Ariella felt something she hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement about her future. Not because of what someone else might give her or take away, but because of what she could build with her own hands and dedication. That evening, Nick finally came home to find Elaine in the living room, surrounded by shopping bags from her afternoon expedition. The coffee table was covered with jewelry boxes, designer shoes, and clothing with price tags that made his vision blur. "How was your day, baby?" she asked, without looking up from the necklace she was admiring in a hand mirror. "Elaine, we need to have a serious conversation." Something in his tone made her look up, and for a moment, her perfect mask slipped to reveal a flicker of irritation. Oh God, not the money speech again. I thought we were past this. We're not past anything. We're deeper in it than ever. Nick sat down across from her, avoiding the shopping bags. I got another call from the mortgage company today. If I don't make a payment by Friday, they're starting foreclosure proceedings. Elaine set down the mirror and crossed her legs, her expression shifting to something between boredom and annoyance. So make a payment. With what money, Elaine? Do you see this? He gestured at the shopping bags. This represents more money than I make in a month. We can't keep living like this. We? There was that word again, delivered with the precise coldness of a surgical instrument. Nick, let me be very clear about something. I didn't sign up to be some struggling housewife, clipping coupons and shopping at Target. I have a certain lifestyle, certain expectations. And what about my expectations? What about having a partner who cares more about me than about what I can buy her? Elaine laughed, and it was the sound of something beautiful and sharp breaking. Partner? Is that what you think this is? Nick, honey, you're a real estate agent in a declining market who left his stable wife for me. I'm not your partner. I'm your prize, and prizes require maintenance. The words hit him like physical blows. This was it, the moment when all pretense fell away and he could see exactly what he'd traded his marriage for. Not love, not partnership, not even genuine affection. He'd traded everything for the privilege of financially supporting someone who saw him as nothing more than a source of income. What if I can't maintain you anymore? He asked quietly. Elaine's smile was bright and merciless. Then I guess we'll both have to reassess our options, won't we? She stood up, gathering her shopping bags with the efficiency of someone who had had this conversation before. I'm going to put these away. When you figure out how to handle your financial situation like a grown man, we can talk about something more pleasant. As she walked upstairs, Nick sat alone in the living room that had once been his and Ariella's sanctuary. The furniture was different now, more expensive and less comfortable. The photos on the mantel showed him and Elaine at various social events, all smiles and expensive clothes. But looking at them now, he couldn't remember a single moment of genuine happiness captured in those images. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Offerman, this is First National Mortgage Services. We need to speak with you immediately regarding your account. Please call 206-555-0147. Nick stared at the message, then at the shopping bags Elaine had left scattered around the room, then at the photos on the mantel. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear Elaine on the phone upstairs, her voice carrying clearly. I know, Tiffany, but what did you expect? Men like Nick are only good for so long. Thank God I kept Richard's number. And in that moment, sitting in his own living room listening to the woman he'd destroyed his marriage for casually planning his replacement, Nick finally understood what Ariella must have felt the day she found them together. The betrayal, the humiliation, the crushing realization that everything you'd believed was real had been nothing but an elaborate lie. The difference was, Ariella had done nothing to deserve it. He had earned every moment of this pain. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic but determined. Nick signed for the certified mail with hands that trembled slightly, knowing before he opened the envelope what it would contain. 30 days. He had 30 days to bring his mortgage current or lose the house entirely. Elaine was still asleep upstairs when he sat at the kitchen table, spreading the legal documents across the surface like tarot cards predicting a dark future. The amount due was staggering, not just the missed payments but late fees, legal costs, and penalties that had accumulated like interest on a debt to the universe itself. His phone rang, startling him from his calculations. Janet Kellaway's name appeared on the screen, and Nick felt his stomach drop. Ariella's lawyer had no reason to call him unless something had gone very wrong, or very right, depending on your perspective. Mr. Offerman, this is Janet Kellaway. I represent your ex-wife. I know who you are, Nick said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I'm calling to inform you that we've been contacted by First National regarding the property at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive. As you know, Mrs. Offerman remains a co-borrower on the original loan. Nick closed his eyes. Of course. In all his panic about the foreclosure, he'd forgotten that Ariella's name was still on the mortgage. What does that mean exactly? It means the bank has offered her the opportunity to assume the loan and prevent foreclosure. Given her current employment and the modest payment amount relative to current market rents, she qualifies for the assumption. The words hit Nick like a physical blow. She's taking the house? She's considering it. I wanted to give you the courtesy of advance notice. If she moves forward, you'll need to vacate the property within 60 days of the assumption. After Janet hung up, Nick sat in the kitchen he'd renovated with Ariella 3 years ago, looking at the granite countertops and custom cabinets that had once seemed like symbols of their success. Soon, all of it would belong to her again. The woman he'd betrayed and abandoned would be living in the house he'd lost, sleeping in the bedroom where he'd destroyed their marriage, cooking in the kitchen where she'd once made him breakfast every morning with a smile and a kiss. The irony was so complete, it felt orchestrated by a malevolent god. Upstairs, Elaine was finally stirring, and Nick could hear her moving around, getting ready for what was undoubtedly another day of spending money he no longer had. He climbed the stairs slowly, feeling like a man walking to his execution. "Morning, baby," Elaine said without turning around as she applied mascara in the bathroom mirror. "I was thinking we could drive up to Vancouver this weekend. There's a new spa resort that just opened, and Diane Chambers says it's absolutely divine." Nick leaned against the doorframe, studying the woman he'd sacrificed everything for. Even first thing in the morning, she was perfectly put together, hairstyled, makeup flawless, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. "Elaine, I just got served with foreclosure papers." She paused in her mascara application for exactly 2 seconds. "Well, that's unfortunate. I suppose you'll have to figure something out. We're going to lose the house." "You're going to lose the house," she corrected, capping her mascara tube with a decisive click. "It was never mine to begin with." Nick felt something snap inside him. 3 months ago, you were calling it our home. You were making plans to renovate the bathroom, talking about hosting dinner parties here. Elaine turned to face him fully, and her expression was perfectly calm. 3 months ago, you were solvent. Things change, Nick. Smart women adapt. And what exactly does adaptation look like for you? Her smile was bright and sharp as a blade. "Well, funny you should ask. Richard called last night while you were sulking downstairs. Apparently his divorce from that dreadful wife of his was finalized last month, and he's been thinking about me. A lot." The casual way she delivered the news, as if she were discussing the weather or her lunch plans, made Nick's vision blur with a rage so pure it scared him. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away?" "Walk away?" Elaine laughed. "Nick, honey, I'm not walking anywhere. I'm running. You've become a liability, and I don't do liabilities." Meanwhile, across town at Swedish Medical Center, Ariella was having her 36-week checkup, marveling at how different this pregnancy felt from what she'd imagined it would be. She'd always pictured Nick holding her hand during these appointments, both of them excited and nervous and planning together. Instead, she sat alone in the examination room, but she didn't feel lonely. She felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else. "Everything looks perfect, Ariella, doctor," Lisa Thornton said, cleaning the ultrasound gel from Ariella's belly. "Clara's measuring right on track, her heartbeat is strong, and you're handling the pregnancy beautifully." "Thank you. I feel good. Really good, actually." Dr. Thornton, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying blonde hair, smiled as she made notes in Ariella's chart. "How's your support system? Do you have help lined up for after the birth?" "My sister Emma will be staying with me for the first 2 weeks, and my job has been incredibly understanding about maternity leave. Mrs. Dunn even offered me a promotion when I come back." "That's wonderful. You know, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I can usually tell which of my patients are going to thrive as mothers. You have something special, Ariella. Clara is lucky to have you." As Ariella drove home from her appointment, she allowed herself to think about the conversation she'd had with Janet Kellaway that morning. The house, their house, could be hers again. It seemed impossible, like something out of a fairy tale, but Janet had explained the legalities carefully. Nick's financial irresponsibility had created an opportunity that Ariella could seize if she wanted to. The question was, did she want to? That evening she sat in her small apartment with Emma, who had come over with Chinese takeout and moral support. "So you could actually get the house back?" Emma asked, setting down her chopsticks with a look of amazement. "Apparently. Janet says the bank would rather work with someone who can actually make the payments than go through a full foreclosure. And technically, I never gave up my rights as a co-borrower. That's incredible. It's like justice." Ariella nodded slowly, her hand resting on her belly where Clara was having one of her evening dance parties. "It feels surreal. That house has so many memories, good and bad. I'm not sure if going back would be healing or just painful. Maybe it would be both. Maybe that's exactly what you need. To reclaim that space. Make new memories there with Clara. The irony isn't lost on me," Ariella said softly. Nick thought he was getting everything. The house, the other woman, the freedom to do whatever he wanted. Instead, he's losing the house to me. The other woman is abandoning him, and his freedom has turned into financial ruin. Emma raised her water glass. To Karma being a patient but thorough teacher. Ariella smiled and touched her glass to Emma's. To new beginnings, whatever they look like. Back on Maple Ridge Drive, Nick was packing clothes into a suitcase while Elaine chatted cheerfully on the phone with someone who was clearly not him. Her laughter echoed through the house like wind chimes in a storm, beautiful and completely disconnected from the destruction surrounding it. "Oh, Richard, you're terrible," she giggled. "Of course I remember that weekend in Napa. How could I forget?" Nick paused in his packing. Napa. That had been during one of their breaks early in their relationship, when she'd claimed she needed time to think about their future. Apparently, she'd spent that thinking time in wine country with her ex-boyfriend. How many lies had he believed? How many times had she played him while he thought he was winning? He zipped the suitcase closed and took one last look around the bedroom that had once been his sanctuary with Ariella. Soon this room would belong to her again, along with everything else he'd thought he'd claimed as his own. She would sleep in this bed, raise their daughter in this house, and build the life he'd thrown away. And Elaine would be in Richard's bed, in Richard's house, spending Richard's money, until the day Richard stopped being useful to her too. As he carried his suitcase downstairs, Nick realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't angry with Ariella. He was grateful to her. Grateful that she would be the one to save the house from his mistakes. Grateful that Clara would grow up somewhere stable and beautiful, instead of in whatever cheap apartment he could afford now. Grateful that Ariella had been strong enough to survive his betrayal and smart enough not to take him back. He'd lost everything, but at least it was going to someone who deserved it. The thought didn't make him feel better, but it did make him feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A tiny grain of peace in an ocean of regret. The moving truck arrived at 7 in the morning, its diesel engine rumbling through the quiet neighborhood like a mechanical funeral dirge. Nick stood at the window of what had once been his bedroom, watching two men in blue uniforms unload boxes and furniture onto the sidewalk. Everything he owned in the world now fit into a 12-foot truck that would take him to a studio apartment in Ballard, the only place he could afford with his depleted credit and dwindling savings. Elaine had left 3 days earlier, her departure as swift and efficient as everything else about her. She'd taken her clothes, her jewelry, and the expensive electronics he'd bought her over the past year, loading everything into Richard's BMW while Nick was at his real estate office trying to salvage what remained of his career. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter, written on expensive stationery in her perfect handwriting. "Nick, thank you for the lovely months we shared. I hope you understand that sometimes people grow in different directions. I wish you the best in your future endeavors." It read like a polite resignation letter from a job she'd never really wanted in the first place. Now, as Nick loaded his own belongings into cardboard boxes, he could hear his neighbors talking in hushed voices across the street. Word had spread quickly through the affluent neighborhood about the foreclosure, the abandonment, the spectacular fall from grace of the couple who had seemed to have it all. "I heard she left him for a surgeon," Mrs. Peterson was saying to her husband as they collected their morning paper. "Poor man. First his wife, now this." If only they knew that the poor man had brought every bit of this on himself. Meanwhile, across town at Swedish Medical Center, Ariella was sitting in the labor and delivery waiting room, timing contractions that had started at 4 in the morning. At 38 weeks, Clara was apparently ready to make her entrance into the world, and Ariella felt a mix of excitement and nerves that had nothing to do with Nick or houses or any of the drama that had consumed the past year. Emma sat beside her, holding her hand and checking her phone every few minutes. "The contractions are getting closer together. Should we call the nurse?" "In a minute," Ariella said, breathing through another wave. "I want to call Janet first. If we're going to do this thing with the house, it should be today before Clara arrives and everything gets complicated." She dialed Janet Kellaway's number, squeezing Emma's hand as another contraction peaked. "Janet? It's Ariella. I've made my decision about the house. Yes, I want to move forward with the loan assumption. Today, if possible. I'm actually in labor right now, so if we could handle the paperwork quickly." 20 minutes later, Janet arrived at the hospital with a briefcase full of documents, her expression somewhere between amused and amazed. "Only you would want to close on a house while in active labor," Janet said, spreading papers across the waiting room table. "Are you sure about this timing?" "I'm sure about the decision," Ariella said, signing her name with steady hands despite the contractions. I want Clara to come home to that house. It feels right. It feels like justice. As she signed the final document, transferring the mortgage and officially making her the sole owner of 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, Ariella felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with impending motherhood. She was reclaiming more than just a house. She was reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her, the future that had been derailed by betrayal and lies. Congratulations, Janet said, gathering the papers. You are now the proud owner of a beautiful home, just in time for your daughter's arrival. 2 hours later, Nick was loading the last of his belongings into the moving truck when Janet's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out with the confident bearing of someone delivering good news to the right person and bad news to the wrong one. Mr. Offerman, I have some papers for you to sign regarding the property transfer. Nick accepted the documents with the resignation of a man who had run out of ways to be surprised by his own downfall. As he read through the legal language, he realized that Ariella had officially saved the house from foreclosure by assuming the mortgage. The home they had bought together during happier times, the place where they had planned to raise children and grow old together, would now belong entirely to her. When do I need to be out? He asked, his voice remarkably steady. The assumption takes effect immediately, but Mrs. Offerman has agreed to give you until the end of the week to finish moving. Mrs. Offerman. Even after the divorce, even after everything he had done, Ariella was being kind to him. The realization hit Nick like a physical blow to the chest. Is she doing well? Janet studied him for a moment, perhaps trying to determine if the question came from genuine concern or selfish curiosity. She's having the baby today, actually. She signed these papers between contractions this morning. Nick sank down onto the front steps of what was no longer his house, the weight of that information crushing him. While he was loading his possessions into a truck like a refugee from his own poor choices, Ariella was bringing their daughter into the world. Clara would be born today, and she would come home to this house, the house that should have been their family home, but would now be Ariella's sanctuary. Mr. Offerman, Janet said, her voice softer now. For what it's worth, she didn't do this out of spite. She did it because she wants Clara to have a stable home. Everything she's done since the divorce has been about building a better life for that little girl. After Janet left, Nick sat alone on the front steps, watching the moving truck drive away with his belongings. Neighbors continued to whisper and stare, but he no longer cared about their opinions or their gossip. All he could think about was Ariella, probably holding their daughter right now, planning the life they would build together in this house. His phone rang, and for a wild moment, he hoped it might be Ariella, calling to share the news of Clara's birth. Instead, it was his real estate broker, calling with news about the Henderson property. Nick, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we have a buyer for the Henderson place. The bad news is they're offering 2.8, and the commission split is going to be different than we discussed. Nick listened to the details with growing numbness. Even if the sale went through perfectly, the commission would barely cover his current debts, let alone set him up for any kind of recovery. His career, like everything else in his life, had become a series of diminishing returns. As evening approached, Nick found himself sitting in his empty studio apartment, surrounded by boxes he didn't have the energy to unpack. The space was clean but soulless, with thin walls that let him hear every sound from his neighbors and a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. He pulled out his phone and, after a long moment of hesitation, sent a simple text to Ariella. Janet told me about the baby. Congratulations. I hope you and Clara are both healthy. The response came an hour later. Thank you. She's beautiful. 7 lbs, 2 Oz. We're both doing well. Nick stared at the message, trying to imagine what Clara looked like. Whether she had Ariella's gentle eyes or his stubborn chin, he would probably never know. The custody arrangement they had agreed to was minimal. Supervised visits once a month until Clara was older, and only if Ariella felt comfortable with it. He had given up the right to be a father the day he chose Elaine over his family. Later that night, as Nick tried to sleep on a mattress on the floor of his studio apartment, Ariella was awake in her hospital bed, holding Clara against her chest and marveling at the perfect weight of her daughter's tiny body. Clara had dark hair like Nick's, but Ariella's delicate features, and when she opened her eyes, they were the deep blue of a newborn's promise. Hello, beautiful girl, Ariella whispered. Welcome to the world. We're going to be just fine, you and me. Better than fine, actually. We're going to be happy. Through the hospital window, she could see the lights of Seattle twinkling in the distance, and somewhere among those lights was the house that would be their home. Tomorrow, she would take Clara there for the first time, not as the wife of someone who had betrayed her, but as the owner of her own life and her own future. It wasn't the story she had planned to write, but it was turning out to be a much better one than she could have imagined. The key turned in the lock with a soft click that sounded like a promise being kept. Ariella stood on the threshold of 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, holding 3-day-old Clara in her arms, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't experienced in over a year, the feeling of being exactly where she belonged. Emma stood beside her with the diaper bag and a bouquet of flowers from the nurses at Swedish Medical Center. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. Ariella nodded, stepping across the threshold of what was now truly her home. "I'm ready." The house felt different, lighter somehow, as if Nick's departure had lifted a weight that had been pressing down on the walls and floors for months. The furniture was mostly the same, pieces they had chosen together during happier times, but without Elaine's cold additions and expensive accessories, the space felt warm again, welcoming. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting the same golden patterns across the hardwood floors that Ariella remembered from their early days in the house. Clara stirred in her arms, making the tiny mewling sounds that newborns make when they're starting to wake up, and Ariella walked slowly through each room, showing her daughter their home. "This is where you'll take your first steps," she whispered as they moved through the living room. "And here's where we'll have Christmas mornings and birthday parties and all the important moments of your life." In the kitchen, Ariella found that Nick had left everything exactly as she'd had it before the divorce. The coffee maker was in the same spot, the dishes arranged in the cabinets the same way she'd always preferred. It was as if he had tried, in this small way, to give back what he'd taken from her. Meanwhile, across town in his studio apartment, Nick was discovering that starting over at 36 was exponentially harder than starting out at 22. The space felt like a hotel room, temporary and impersonal, despite the familiar belongings scattered around. He'd managed to unpack enough to find clean clothes for work, but most of his boxes remained stacked against the walls like a cardboard fortress protecting him from the reality of his situation. His phone had been quiet all morning. Elaine hadn't contacted him since her departure, and he'd stopped expecting her to. The friends who used to invite them to dinner parties and gallery openings had apparently decided that Nick without money and status wasn't the same person they'd enjoyed socializing with. Even his colleagues at the real estate office treated him differently now, not unkindly, but with the careful distance people maintained around failure, as if bad luck might be contagious. The only call he'd received was from his mother in Portland, who had heard about the divorce and that awful woman through the family grapevine. "I never liked her, Nicholas," his mother had said in her frank, no-nonsense way. "Too polished, too perfect. Real love doesn't come with a price tag attached. Real love." Nick thought about that phrase as he sat in his car outside the grocery store, working up the courage to go inside and buy food for one person. Real love was Ariella making him coffee every morning before work, even when she'd been up late grading papers or preparing activities for the children at the center. Real love was the way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes, and never once made him feel like he wasn't enough just as he was. Real love was what he'd thrown away for the illusion of something shinier. Back on Maple Ridge Drive, Ariella was settling into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Clara was an easy baby, alert when she was awake, peaceful when she slept, and seemingly content to be held and loved by the woman who had already proven she would fight for her. Emma had stayed for the first week, helping with middle-of-the-night feedings and endless loads of tiny laundry. But now Ariella was on her own, and she was surprised to find that she wasn't afraid. She'd converted the guest room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft sage green and filling the space with carefully chosen pieces. A rocking chair from her grandmother, a bookshelf already stocked with classic children's stories, and a mobile of paper cranes that cast dancing shadows on the ceiling when the afternoon sun hit them just right. It was while she was nursing Clara in the rocking chair, listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood waking up, that she heard the doorbell ring. Through the nursery window, she could see Mrs. Dorothy Greenfield from next door standing on the front porch with what appeared to be a casserole dish. Dorothy was a widow in her 70s, who had lived next door for as long as Ariella could remember. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed when your newspaper piled up, and who always had extra tomatoes from her garden to share. She was also, Ariella knew, the unofficial keeper of neighborhood gossip. "Dorothy, how lovely to see you," Ariella said, opening the door with Clara still in her arms. "Oh my stars, let me look at this beautiful baby," Dorothy cooed, immediately reaching for Clara with the confidence of a woman who had raised 4 children and helped with countless grandchildren. "She's absolutely perfect, Ariella. Just perfect." They settled in the living room with cups of tea while Clara slept peacefully in Dorothy's experienced arms. For a few minutes they talked about normal things: the baby's sleep schedule, the unusually warm spring weather, Dorothy's ongoing battle with the raccoons who kept getting into her bird feeders. Then Dorothy's expression grew more serious. "Ariella, dear, I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I'm glad you're back in this house. It never felt right without you." "Thank you, Dorothy. It feels good to be home. I want you to know that the whole neighborhood saw what happened, what he did to you, how that woman treated this place like her personal shopping mall. We all knew it wouldn't last." Ariella shifted uncomfortably. She'd never been one for gossip, even when it was sympathetic to her situation. Dorothy seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'm not telling you this to be unkind, dear. I'm telling you because I want you to know that people see the truth, even when it takes time. You were always the heart of this house, the one who made it a real home. That other woman," she shook her head, "she was just passing through." That afternoon, while Clara napped in her crib, Ariella walked through the house making mental notes of what needed to be done. Some of Elaine's changes would stay. The house was undeniably more beautiful with the updated fixtures and fresh paint, but other touches would need to be softened, made more livable for a mother and child. She was standing in the master bedroom, trying to decide whether to keep the expensive duvet cover Elaine had insisted on, when she noticed something that made her pause. On Nick's nightstand, partially hidden behind a lamp, was a framed photo that she recognized but hadn't seen in months. It was a picture of her and Nick from their 3rd anniversary, taken during a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands. They were sitting on a dock at sunset, her head on his shoulder, both of them laughing at something she couldn't remember now. But what struck her wasn't the happiness in the photo. It was the fact that Nick had kept it there, even while living with Elaine. She picked up the frame, studying the faces of 2 people who had once been so sure of their love, so confident in their future together. The woman in the photo looked younger, more trusting, less aware of how quickly everything could change. The man looked genuinely happy in a way that Nick hadn't seemed in years. For a moment, Ariella felt a flicker of sadness, not for what she'd lost, but for what Nick had lost. He'd given up this kind of uncomplicated happiness for something that had turned out to be an elaborate mirage. Whatever satisfaction Elaine had brought him couldn't have been worth the price he'd paid for it. She set the photo in a box with other mementos that she would eventually give to Nick when Clara was older, and the wounds weren't so fresh. Their marriage was over, but their history deserved to be preserved, if only for their daughter's sake. That evening, as Seattle settled into another peaceful night, Ariella sat in her kitchen feeding Clara a bottle and watching the sun set through the window above the sink. This was the window where she used to stand washing dishes and dreaming about the future, back when the future had included Nick and the life they were going to build together. The future she was building now was different, but no less beautiful. It was smaller in some ways, just her and Clara instead of the big family she'd once imagined, but it was also more honest, built on a foundation of her own strength rather than someone else's promises. Clara finished her bottle and settled against Ariella's shoulder with a contented sigh. Through the kitchen window, Ariella could see the lights coming on in houses throughout the neighborhood, each one representing a family, a story, a collection of hopes and dreams and daily struggles. She was part of that community again, not as Nick Offerman's wife or as the victim of his betrayal, but as Ariella Whitmore, Clara's mother, a woman who had learned that sometimes the best victories were the quiet ones that happened in kitchens and nurseries, measured not in public vindication but in private peace. Outside, the world continued its endless cycle of drama and heartbreak and redemption, but inside 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, all was calm, all was right, and all was exactly as it should be. 3 months had passed since Clara's birth, and autumn was painting Seattle in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ariella why she'd always loved this season. The trees along Maple Ridge Drive were shedding their leaves in gentle spirals, creating a carpet of color that crunched satisfyingly under her feet as she pushed Clara's stroller during their daily walks. Clara had grown into an alert, happy baby who seemed to find wonder in everything from the play of shadows on the ceiling to the sound of wind chimes on the front porch. She had Nick's dark hair but Ariella's gentle temperament, and watching her discover the world felt like witnessing a daily miracle. This morning, Ariella was returning to work for the first time since Clara's birth, and she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that had nothing to do with leaving her daughter. Clara would be staying at Sunshine Children's Center with her, part of the generous child care policy that had made Ariella's promotion to lead teacher possible. "Good morning, Sunshine," Mrs. Dunn said as Ariella wheeled Clara's carrier through the front door of the center. "Are you ready for your first day as our newest lead teacher?" "I think so," Ariella said, settling Clara in the infant room where she could keep an eye on her while working with the older children. "It feels good to be back." The past 3 months had been a period of quiet transformation. Ariella had spent her maternity leave not just caring for Clara, but taking online courses toward her early childhood education certification. She'd also been slowly making the house truly hers again, replacing Elaine's cold touches with warmer, more child-friendly alternatives. The expensive white furniture had been replaced with softer, more practical pieces. The stark walls now featured Clara's handprint in a shadow box and photographs of family moments. Ariella reading to Clara in the rocking chair, Clara's first smile, Emma teaching Clara to play peekaboo. It was a home again, not a showplace. Meanwhile, across town, Nick was discovering that Rock Bottom had a basement. The Henderson property sale had finally closed, but the commission had barely covered his outstanding debts. His career at Cascade Realty was hanging by a thread. Other agents whispered about his personal drama, and clients seemed less willing to trust someone whose own life had fallen apart so spectacularly. This morning, he was sitting in his car outside a smaller, less prestigious real estate office in Northgate, preparing for an interview that felt more like a surrender than an opportunity. Brennan and Associates wasn't where successful agents went to grow their careers. It was where struggling agents went to survive. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Thinking of you today. Remember that every ending is also a beginning." Nick stared at the message, trying to summon the optimism it implied. At 36, starting over felt less like a beginning and more like an admission of failure. But failure was a luxury he could no longer afford. The studio apartment rent was due next week, and his savings account balance was approaching zero. The interview went better than expected. Rebecca Brennan, a woman in her 60s who had built her small agency on helping first-time homebuyers and modest investments, seemed more interested in Nick's willingness to work hard than in the gossip surrounding his personal life. "I don't care about your divorce drama," she said bluntly after reviewing his sales history. "I care about whether you can help a young couple find their first home, and whether you'll treat them with respect instead of looking for the biggest commission in town. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am, I can." "Good. You start Monday. Base salary plus commission. Nothing fancy, but honest work for honest pay." As Nick left the interview, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Relief. It wasn't the high-flying success he'd once enjoyed, but it was a chance to rebuild on a foundation of humility instead of arrogance. That afternoon, while Ariella was leading story time at the Children's Center, she received a text from Emma. "Saw on social media that the redhead is engaged to that surgeon. Big fancy announcement. Guess she moves fast." Ariella read the message while Clara napped peacefully in the infant room. She felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no curiosity about the details. Elaine had simply moved on to her next target, as everyone who really knew her had expected she would. She typed back to Emma, "Good for her. I hope she gets exactly what she's looking for." And she meant it. Elaine would probably have a beautiful wedding, an expensive lifestyle, and all the material success she'd ever wanted. But Ariella had learned the difference between getting what you want and getting what you need, between being successful and being happy, between winning a prize and building a life. Later that evening, as Ariella gave Clara her bath in the upstairs bathroom of their home, she reflected on how much her definition of victory had changed. A year ago, she might have seen Elaine's engagement as proof that bad people sometimes won. Now she understood that everyone eventually got exactly what they chose to pursue. Elaine had chosen security and status, and she would probably get both. Nick had chosen excitement and validation, and he'd gotten a harsh lesson about the difference between lust and love. Ariella had chosen dignity and self-respect, even when it meant walking away from everything familiar, and she'd discovered strength she never knew she possessed. Clara splashed in the warm water, gurgling with delight as soap bubbles floated around her. Outside the bathroom window, the last light of day was fading into purple dusk, and somewhere in that growing darkness, Nick was probably sitting in his studio apartment, learning to live with the consequences of his choices. The thought didn't make Ariella happy or sad. It was simply the truth, as immutable as the seasons changing or the tide coming in. She had her own life to live now, her own future to build, and every day brought new proof that sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is losing something you thought you couldn't live without. As she lifted Clara from the bath and wrapped her in a soft towel, Ariella smiled. They had everything they needed right here in this house, in this moment, in the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt from the ground up. And for the first time since this whole journey began, that felt like more than enough. It felt like everything. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning, Seattle was dressed in its winter finest. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, transforming the city into a postcard of itself, and the holiday decorations throughout the neighborhood seemed to glow with extra warmth against the white backdrop. Ariella stood at the kitchen window of 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, watching 8-month-old Clara in her high chair, enthusiastically destroying a piece of banana while giggling at her own mess. The house was decorated for Christmas, not the expensive magazine-perfect decorations that Elaine had preferred, but the warm, slightly chaotic kind that comes from a home where a baby lives and love matters more than appearances. A small tree sat in the corner of the living room, decorated with handmade ornaments from the children's center and family heirlooms that had been packed away during the Elaine years. Under the tree were carefully wrapped presents, mostly practical things for Clara, but also a few treats for Ariella herself, gifts from Emma and Mrs. Dunn and the other people who had become her chosen family. The morning mail brought something unexpected, an envelope with her name written in Nick's familiar handwriting. Inside was a check for $500 and a note written on plain paper. Ariella, this is the first child support payment. I know it's not much and I know it's late, but it's the beginning of what I hope will be a reliable contribution to Clara's care. I'm working at a smaller firm now, making less money, but living more honestly. I hope someday you'll feel comfortable letting me be part of Clara's life in some small way. I think about both of you every day. Nick Ariella read the note twice, then set it aside to consider later. The money was welcome. Child support had been part of their divorce agreement, but she hadn't expected Nick to follow through given his financial struggles. The fact that he had, even when money was obviously tight, suggested something had shifted in him. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Mrs. Dunn's name appeared on the screen, and Ariella smiled as she answered. Good morning, Carol. Ariella, dear. I hope I'm not calling too early. I have some wonderful news. The state just approved our application for the Early Childhood Development Grant. We're going to be able to expand the infant program, and I'd like you to oversee the new classroom. Ariella felt her heart skip. The grant application had been a long shot, additional funding that would allow Sunshine Children's Center to serve more families and provide better resources for the children they already cared for. Being asked to oversee the expansion was recognition of the work she'd done, the growth she'd achieved in the past year. That's incredible, Carol. I'm honored. You've earned it. Your leadership with the older children has been exceptional, and your insights about infant care from your experience with Clara have been invaluable. We'll talk details after the holidays, but I wanted you to know as soon as possible. After they hung up, Ariella sat at her kitchen table watching Clara play with her toys on the floor nearby. A year ago, she'd been a woman whose life was falling apart, whose future seemed uncertain and frightening. Now she was a homeowner, a successful early childhood educator, a mother raising a happy, healthy daughter, and a woman who had discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was undeniably a good life. Meanwhile, across town, Nick was having a very different kind of morning. He stood in the bathroom of his studio apartment, adjusting a tie that had seen better days, preparing for another day of showing modest homes to young couples and first-time buyers. The work was honest, but barely paid enough to cover his basic expenses and the child support he was determined to send Ariella every month. The check he'd sent to Ariella had taken most of his discretionary income for the month, leaving him with enough for rent, basic groceries, and little else. His credit was still ruined, his social circle had evaporated, and he still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, thinking about everything he'd destroyed. His phone rang as he was gathering his keys and briefcase. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, the voice was familiar. Nick, this is Rebecca Brennan. I have some news for you. Rebecca had been a fair but demanding boss over the past few months, pushing Nick to work harder and more ethically than he had in years. The small commissions barely covered his expenses, and he'd had to take a second job on weekends doing property photography to make ends meet. Good morning, Rebecca. What's the news? The Johnsons, that young couple you've been working with for 3 months. They just called. They got the house. Their offer was accepted and they wanted me to tell you that they've never had a realtor work so hard to find them the right home within their budget. Nick felt a genuine smile spread across his face, followed immediately by the familiar stab of regret. The Johnsons reminded him of who he and Ariella had been as young newlyweds, full of dreams, working hard for everything they achieved. He'd thrown away that innocence for shallow success and a woman who'd never really wanted him. That's wonderful news. It is. And Nick, I've been watching how you work with clients like the Johnsons. You care about finding them the right home, not just making a sale. That's rare these days. As Nick hung up the phone, he realized that while he felt pride in his work, it was tainted by the knowledge that he'd probably never fully recover from the damage he'd done to his reputation and his life. Some mistakes you lived with forever, and choosing Elaine over Ariella was one of them. That afternoon, Ariella was walking through downtown Seattle with Clara in her stroller, doing some last-minute Christmas shopping, when she saw something that made her stop. In the window of a small gallery was a photograph that took her breath away, a black-and-white image of the Seattle waterfront at dawn, with the Olympic Mountains rising in the background like sleeping giants. She recognized the style immediately. It was Nick's work. During their marriage, photography had been Nick's hobby, his creative outlet from the demands of real estate. He'd been talented, with an eye for light and composition that had always impressed her. But as his career had consumed more of his time and attention, he'd gradually abandoned the camera in favor of more profitable pursuits. Seeing his work displayed in a gallery window, with a small red dot indicating it had been sold, suggested he'd return to photography not out of artistic fulfillment, but out of financial necessity. The weekend work barely supplemented his meager real estate income, but it was what he had to do to survive. As she stood there looking at the photograph, Ariella felt a complex mix of emotions. She could see the beauty in his work, but she also recognized the desperation behind it. A man trying to patch together a living from the pieces of his broken life. The photograph was good, but it also represented how far he'd fallen from the success he'd once taken for granted. For Clara's sake, she hoped he'd continue to grow as a person. But she also understood that some consequences lasted forever, and Nick would probably spend the rest of his life paying for the choices he'd made that day he chose Elaine over his family. That evening, as Seattle's early winter darkness settled over the city, Ariella was giving Clara her bath when the doorbell rang. Through the bathroom window, she could see a delivery truck in the driveway. Wrapping Clara in a towel, she hurried downstairs to find a large poinsettia on the front porch with a card attached. The plant was beautiful, deep red blooms with dark green leaves, obviously expensive and carefully chosen. The card was signed by all the families at Sunshine Children's Center. Thank you for making our children's days brighter. Merry Christmas to you and Clara. As Ariella carried the plant inside, she reflected on how much her life had changed. A year ago, she'd felt invisible, unappreciated, taken for granted by the one person whose opinion had mattered most to her. Now she was surrounded by people who valued her work, respected her dedication, and cared about her well-being. She'd lost a husband, but she'd gained a community. Later that night, after Clara was asleep in her crib, Ariella sat in the living room with a cup of tea, surrounded by the gentle glow of Christmas lights. The house was quiet and peaceful, filled with the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "How are you spending your first Christmas in the house?" Ariella typed back, quietly, "Perfectly." Any regrets about how everything turned out? Ariella considered the question seriously. Did she regret the pain of discovering Nick's betrayal? The months of uncertainty and struggle? The loss of the future she'd planned? But then she looked around the living room she'd made beautiful with her own hands, thought about the work that fulfilled her, the daughter who brought her joy every single day, the independence she'd never known she wanted until she'd been forced to find it. "None," she typed back. "Not a single one." Outside, snow began to fall again, dusting the windows and covering the world in pristine white. Somewhere in the city, Nick was probably sitting in his small apartment, eating a simple dinner alone and calculating whether he could afford both groceries and gas money for the next week. The photography work helped, but he still lived paycheck to paycheck, forever marked by the choices he'd made. Somewhere else, Elaine was planning her wedding to Richard, having smoothly transitioned to her next target without missing a beat. But here, in this house that had been lost and reclaimed, in this life that had been shattered and rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful, Ariella Whitmore was exactly where she was meant to be. The past was finished. The future was hers to write. and for the first time since this whole story began, she was excited to see what came next. 2 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the backyard of 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, where 2.5-year-old Clara chased soap bubbles with the determined concentration that only toddlers possessed. Her dark hair caught the light as she ran, her laugh echoing off the garden walls that Ariella had painted a cheerful yellow last spring. Ariella sat on the back porch, watching her daughter's pure joy while sipping coffee from a mug that read, "World's Best Teacher," a gift from her students at Sunshine Children's Center. At 34, she had grown into the woman she'd always been meant to be, confident without being hard, strong without being bitter, independent without being closed off to the possibility of love. The infant room she now coordinated had become a model for other centers throughout the state. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was work that mattered, that helped families build better lives for their children. Every day she went home knowing she had made a difference in the world, one child at a time. "Mama, bubbles!" Clara squealed, pointing at the iridescent spheres floating past her outstretched fingers. "I see them, baby girl. Try to catch the biggest one." The house had evolved over the past 2 years into something that was entirely theirs. The walls were filled with Clara's artwork, family photos, and certificates recognizing Ariella's professional achievements. The garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers that Clara helped tend, teaching her the patience and wonder that came from nurturing growing things. It was a good life, simple, honest, and filled with the kind of contentment that couldn't be bought or borrowed or stolen. Ariella's phone rang, displaying Emma's name on the screen. "Good morning, Em." "Morning, sister. I have news. Big news. Good news or bad news?" "Wonderful news. David proposed last night." Ariella felt her heart lift for her sister, who had found love with a kind-hearted veterinarian who appreciated Emma's fiery spirit and gentle heart. "Oh, Em, that's incredible. Tell me everything." As Emma chattered excitedly about the proposal and their plans for a small wedding in the fall, Ariella watched Clara discover a ladybug on the porch railing. Her daughter's capacity for wonder reminded Ariella daily that the best parts of life were often the smallest ones. Dewdrops on spider webs, the sound of rain on the roof, the weight of a sleeping child in your arms. "Are you happy, Ariella?" Emma asked suddenly, interrupting her own wedding chatter. "Really, truly happy?" Ariella considered the question while watching Clara gently stroke the ladybug with one tiny finger. "You know, Em, I think I am. Not the way I thought happiness would look when I was younger, but yes, completely." Meanwhile, across town in his studio apartment, Nick was getting dressed for another day of showing modest homes to hopeful young families. The past 2 years had been a long, slow climb toward something resembling stability, though he remained keenly aware that his current life was the direct result of choices that had cost him everything that mattered. He'd managed to scrape together enough for a slightly larger apartment, still small, still basic, but with enough room for the weekend visits with Clara that had finally been arranged after months of supervised meetings. Seeing his daughter once every other Saturday was both the highlight of his week and a painful reminder of the daily moments he'd forfeited when he chose Elaine over his family. Clara was polite with him, the way children are with friendly strangers, but there was none of the easy affection he saw in her interactions with Ariella. He was her father by biology, but he was not her daddy in any meaningful sense of the word. That honor he had abdicated through his own selfishness. The photography work had grown slowly into something more than mere survival. Galleries occasionally featured his work, and he'd even had a few commissioned pieces. But the income remained modest, and he still lived paycheck to paycheck, sending every extra dollar to Ariella for Clara's needs. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca Brennan. "Johnson Referral wants to meet today at 2. Young couple, first-time buyers. Very nice people." Nick smiled slightly. Helping young couples find their first homes had become his specialty, partly because his own fall from grace had taught him to value what really mattered. He couldn't give them the luxury properties his old clients had wanted, but he could help them find places where they could build the kinds of lives he'd thrown away. It wasn't redemption. Some mistakes couldn't be redeemed, only lived with. But it was honest work, and in small moments it felt like maybe he was slowly becoming the man he should have been all along. Across the city, in the elegant Belltown penthouse she now shared with her husband, Elaine was having her morning coffee while scrolling through social media. Dr. Richard Holbrook had proven to be everything she'd calculated he would be: successful, stable, and generous with his money. Their wedding photos had been featured in Seattle Magazine, and their social calendar was packed with the kind of events that mattered to people who measured life by appearances. She was, by any objective measure, exactly where she'd planned to be, but sometimes, in quiet moments like this one, Elaine found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Ariella at that coffee shop nearly 2 years ago. Ariella's question had stayed with her. "I hope you and Richard are happy together. Real happy, not just successful happy." The distinction had seemed meaningless at the time, but as Elaine looked around her perfectly appointed penthouse, she wondered if maybe there had been wisdom in those words. She had everything she'd wanted, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still just passing through, waiting for something more or better or different to come along. Richard was kind to her, generous and dependable, but their relationship felt more like a successful business merger than anything resembling love. They were compatible, but they weren't connected. They shared a lifestyle, but not a life. She pushed the thought away, as she always did. She had made her choice, and it was the smart choice. Love was for people who couldn't afford to be practical. Back on Maple Ridge Drive, Clara had fallen asleep in her stroller after an eventful morning of bubble chasing and ladybug watching. Ariella was folding tiny clothes on the porch when she noticed an envelope in her mailbox that made her pause. It was addressed to Clara Whitmore in Nick's handwriting. Inside was a savings account statement showing monthly deposits of $50, money Nick had been setting aside for Clara's college fund, even though his own budget was stretched to its limits. There was also a short note, "For Clara's future. I know it's not much, but I want her to have opportunities, even if I can't be the father she deserves every day. Thank you for raising her to be such an amazing little girl." And Ariella read the note twice, then looked at Clara sleeping peacefully in her stroller. Nick was trying, in his limited way, to contribute something meaningful to their daughter's life. It didn't erase what he'd done, didn't change the fact that his choices had consequences that would last forever, but it suggested that somewhere inside the man who had betrayed them was still the person she'd once loved. She wouldn't tell Clara about the college fund yet. She was too young to understand. But someday, when Clara was older and could appreciate the gesture for what it was, Ariella would explain that even when people make terrible mistakes, they can still try to do better. It wouldn't be enough to repair the damage, but it was something. That evening, as Seattle settled into another peaceful night, Ariella sat in Clara's nursery reading Goodnight Moon for the 100th time. Clara's eyes were heavy, but she fought sleep the way children do when they don't want the day to end. "Goodnight stars, goodnight air, goodnight noises everywhere," Ariella read softly. "Goodnight, Mama," Clara mumbled, already half asleep. "Goodnight, sweet girl. I love you more than all the stars in the sky." As Clara's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, Ariella sat in the rocking chair for a few extra minutes, watching her daughter's peaceful face and thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, she'd been a woman whose life was built around someone else's choices, someone else's dreams, someone else's definitions of success and happiness. She'd thought she needed Nick to be complete, thought their marriage was the foundation of her identity. Now she knew better. The foundation of her identity was her own strength, her own choices, her own capacity to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what she'd lost. Nick hadn't completed her. He'd limited her, kept her from becoming the woman she was meant to be. Clara stirred slightly in her sleep, and Ariella gently tucked the blanket around her daughter's shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to grow and learn and become. But tonight, in this house that was truly theirs, surrounded by the life they'd built together, everything was exactly as it should be. Some stories ended with revenge, some ended with reconciliation, but the best stories, Ariella had learned, ended with the quiet triumph of a life well lived, a choice well made, and a love that asked for nothing in return, except the chance to grow. Outside the nursery window, the lights of Seattle twinkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere among those lights, 3 people were living with the consequences of their choices. One had chosen love and lost everything. One had chosen money and gained exactly what she'd wanted. And one had chosen dignity and discovered that sometimes losing everything was actually the first step toward finding yourself. In the end, everyone got exactly what they deserved. The end. What do you think about this story? Ariella lost everything when she discovered the betrayal, but ended up gaining much more than she imagined. Nick chose what seemed best at the time and paid a price he never expected. Elaine got exactly what she always wanted, but did she find what she really needed? After following this whole journey, what was the moment in the story that touched you the most, and why? Share in the comments which part touched your heart the most. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like to help me out. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next stories. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.